BProcessing.com. I'm going to show you how to do a focus stack start to finish without any details. The crucial things here are, how do you approach a focus stacking exercise? It's fairly complicated and thus fairly intimidating to those who might not have done it before. And there are some things that if you follow this approach will save you a lot of time and give you a lot better results. Now what I'm showing here is Photoshop, and to get to that we first had to process images. So in the Finder, here in this window, there's 13 originals which were enhanced, as I show in another video, another workflow video, enhanced with a small amount of noise reduction. Those 13 images were then processed into these 13 TIFF files, 16-bit and wide gamut color space, and those are what are going to feed into both Photoshop and Zareen Stacker. There's also a DMAP, that's a first stack from the stacking program Zareen Stacker. Okay, so back to Photoshop. What you'll see here is I've got all the frames that were needed for the stack plus a stack frame. And if I disable these, you'll see that the first frame is quite blurry in the distance. The last frame is quite sharp but blurry in the foreground. And our stack is sharp everywhere. What's the point of layering these like this? There's several things. You want to be able to scan your stack before you put in all the work for various things. First of all, you want to see and discard any frames that aren't going to help you in the stack. Maybe you have too many frames than you need. You don't actually have any far distance, so there may be 3 or 4 frames that go blurry beyond the last subject detail. You may have, say, some severe motion problems, and at this point, by going through these frames, you might get to a frame and ask yourself, well, at some intermediate point, is there something that's so troublesome that maybe I just won't try this stack? An example of that would have been if I had, say, a big bush right here where I'm waving the mouse, and it's waving around wildly in the wind, and maybe it sticks up enough to be up against the background. It's going to be fairly hopeless when you have a strong near-far gap and something that's moving. It would be extremely tedious and troublesome to retouch that. This scene has nothing like that, but it does occur, so be aware of that. Next, you're also going to look at these frames, and you'll notice how the background's blurry here. If I zoom in to actual pixels, you can see I've started the focus very close, including even this grass here, and it quickly goes out of focus. So one reason you have this is so that while you're retouching, you can refer to it for where the transitions are between each frame. So if I click the next frame, we'll see that it retains sharpness on that foreground grass, almost, but mainly what it does is you'll see in this rock area here, it's now picking up all of this rock sharply and somewhat beyond. Maybe we don't even need that first frame. Maybe we're really just willing to forego this grass here because it's reasonably sharp anyway. And it can be troublesome to try to get every bit of foreground in there. So I might not actually use this first frame because it doesn't have much to contribute, including this stone here, which comes into focus on the second frame. So right away you might discard that first frame as just kind of like causing more trouble than it's worth. So you won't even stack that frame. Or you might do a stack and have the frame but not include it in the stack and then use it for very localized retouching. Okay, similarly you can click these frames and you can watch the focus walk further and further distance. And this is going to be very helpful when you're stacking because you have a transition here from, for example, this rock. You can see that may be the sharpest frame there, and it's not sharp next to it. These are going to be your trouble areas at these near-far edges. And you kind of want to see, well, which frame is going to get me fully sharp there. And this frame here, it's not only sharp here on this ground cover, but it's reasonably sharp along the edge. So you might be able to cheat, and if you have an edge problem, you might not, but if you do have an edge problem, retouch this edge using that frame that's reasonably sharp here on the edge of the rock plus the background. I often do that. You get, technically, the finer grained you get, the better you can be here in localized areas, but often it's much more practical to just paint over an edge with the more distant thing. And so you're going to, this is your reference while you're retouching, because I think it's just too slow to scroll in Zerine Stacker while you're retouching. You notice the grasses aren't fully sharp here, so you'll want to know, well, where do they start to get fully sharp? Does the far distance frame, which is that one, can that be used? In this case, no, it can't. You can see they're soft. And in general, think of this as bands of sharpness, left to right, from across this distance here where I'm moving the mouse and up to about this point in the rock. There's going to be one frame that's optimal. Well, actually, it's going to be the water across to the left, and then as you and this stuff, and then as you hit this rock face, it's going to be probably 2 or 3 frames earlier. So think of it as bands of sharpness and which frames you're going to need to use in order to retouch. And just to say it again, some focus stacks can be kind of hopeless if you have the subject matter just moving around too much, where you have a near versus far type of thing. Same thing for like lens blur around out of focus things. There are other techniques we'll have to discuss in another video. All right, so how do we actually go about the retouching? Switching to Zerine Stacker, I've got the 13 frames upper left here. I've already saved a stack because that takes several minutes, so we don't want to wait for it. I'm not going to really show much of the retouching here, but I'm going to discuss how you go about it. So to start retouching, you're going to well, first you're going to select the frame you want to work with. I usually start with distance, so that's frame number 13, and you'll select the output image you're going to work with. We only see DMAP here, but soon you might see retouched 1, retouched 2, retouched 3, and so on. So select the ones you're going to work with and say start retouching, and it'll do some preparation so it's not instantaneous. Now there's a fit to window mode, which is useful, except that it's not smart enough in this case for this layout. So I like this over-under layout because I typically want to scan across the frame. So you can choose that set over-under layout. And in this case, one cool thing about Zerine Stacker is you can go in here and you can say, I want some percentage, and you can pick, say 25%, and you can see it's not the full width. I determined that it's 40% on my screen. Gives me kind of the full width of the frame. Maybe not exactly all of it, but that's very handy for the retouching. So the first thing I'll typically do is I will go to the distance frame. So I press and hold the space bar and drag to move up. You can use the scroll bars too, and in this case, I've previously examined those frames in Photoshop, and I happen to know that everything in the distance up to and including these trees here, and these trees, can be dealt with using that number 13 far distance frame. And that's a huge win because I don't have to worry about any motion blur or anything like that. So if I start retouching here, you'll see the clouds weren't moving real fast, so you're not really seeing much, but in some cases even the clouds will improve. So you definitely want to go over all the clouds and that sort of stuff. So I'm not going to do all that detail work. It takes time. But if this tree here on the right were moving in the wind, for example, you'd absolutely want to retouch that. Notice that I don't want this circle to go on these rocks, otherwise I'm going to retouch that area too. So you got to come in here and kind of go most of the way and retouch that area. Those edges you're going to come back to later with different frames. So your first pass, I'm gonna shrink this down a little bit more to so we can see more of it. Your first pass, I recommend paint over everything that's covered by that last infinity focus frame. And in this case, I'll make this circle a little smaller. I like the original Apple wired mouse, by the way, because a little scroll thing on top lets you change the size of the circle just by activating that. So I would retouch everything following this cursor, everything roughly along this area from all this stuff is going to get wiped out, or almost all of it, with the last frame, painting over it. So there'll be no conflict with motion or lighting changes or anything like that. And that last frame will essentially be perfect. Now, it gets harder when you run into motion. And that's part of why you do that initial evaluation in Photoshop. Going back to Photoshop and zooming in, actually, I'm going to teach you another trick. If you're running a retina display, it can be awfully hard to see what's sharp and what's not. So you're going to want to size it up. It's 11:648. Naturally, I recommend typically well, I'm a geek, so 1.414 is the square root of 2. That will double the pixel count. Size it up, and it'll be a lot easier to assess it. I'm not going to do it here because it takes a while. And on that note, you'll also want plenty of memory. I'm already using 42 gigabytes in Photoshop and 8 or 10 in Serene Stacker. So that's 52 gigabytes of real memory being used already while we do this. So buy an appropriate machine if you're going to do this sort of stuff. So I'm not going to resize that because I've already done one. So I'll go into one I've already done this with and zoom in. So by making it and sizing it up, you can more easily see where the sharpness really is. But what I wanted to show you here is that the water's in constant motion because of this wind ruffling it. And so at close range, it's all blurry, of course, but somewhere like the second or third to last frame, you'll see these the grasses at lower left down here are blurry. Then we go a little farther, and so each time notice that I'll click on and off. Notice that the water is moving constantly. The good news with water is you can get away with a lot. Sometimes there's patterns there, problem, but basically the stacking is going to get real confused by this water. You know, it looks like it's sort of okay, but it's really not. You've got all this weird, the ripples are discontinuous and disjointed. You're going to want to paint over that for the top quality result. So therefore, you're going to need to decide which frame is going to do the water. For example, if we go to the rear of it, we'll want to find, it's probably, I'm guessing here, that the second to the last frame we can work on this water. Let's go back a little bit. So you can see it's blurry there, getting sharper. It looks sharp there. I'm looking at the rock mainly and the water down here. And the infinity frame might even be a little better. So I can probably paint that infinity frame over this section of water here. But moving a little closer, that's probably not going to be ideal. So we're going to want to use the second to last frame to go in a band across the water here, and so on. So that's a little tedious, but as long as you think in terms of bands, you'll have a pretty good time at it. The other trick you can do is turn on rulers and drag a guideline to remember yourself about where I'm just guessing here, about where the zone of sharpness falls, at least for the water. And that way you can remind yourself by frame number. I'll drag this wider. So like frame 467 is the second to infinity and 66 the next, and so on back to the closest one. So by using the frame numbers in there, you can remind yourself. By the way, all that information in there is, I use a script I wrote, and I may publish those at some point. But that includes the frame number. You might want to have something like that too. Anyway, so those guidelines can be helpful to remind you where things are. And remember that this rock face at the right is much closer than this rock here, which is much closer than the water. And so it can get real tricky when you got a 3D sort of scene. You know, we got to back way up on this rock to frame 5 or whatever to get this rock here, and we got to go to frame 7 or so to get this rock here. So hopefully the stacking program has done that for you, and here's the stack. You can see it's done a pretty darn fine job on it. So you probably won't have to do much there, if at all. You know, in general, if shot correctly and with no motion, you don't really have to retouch this stuff. And this rock wall is arcing away from us sharply. So it'd be quite a pain because you've basically got vertical bands of sharpness at different distances. You know, certain frame will be good here, another frame will be good here, another frame will be good here, but maybe it dimples in or out. That can get really tedious. So you may not want to bother. On the other hand, if it's a section that's clearly best at one frame, let's say the second frame is clearly best in this corner, you might want to paint that in. But notice the very rapid transition from sharpness here to unsharp. So you've got to be very careful not to be retouching and actually make things worse. So, and in dark areas like this, it's probably not worth the effort to mess with that too much. On the other hand, this leading rock face here, it's probably worth our effort to go in there and retouch, paint in this for the very best results, maybe not doing this leading edge here so much. And that way you can optimize sharpness a little more, because the stacking program won't have had to try to stack random noise and tiny little shadow changes and other things that can occur even no matter how fast you shoot it. Similarly, this wall here on one of these frames is going to be at peak sharpness. Maybe that one there, or maybe maybe this one, maybe even that one. This is at pretty uniform distance, so you could paint in on that. Now, I'll remind you, we're here in Photoshop, and you're not doing any retouching in here. You're going to do it in Design Stacker, but the reason we have all these frames layered up like this is because we can click on and off to determine what is best where very quickly and efficiently, whereas that's much harder to do in Design Stacker while you're stacking. All right, so to summarize, we're going to first retouch distance with our distance frame. We're going to take our last best infinity focus frame, and we're going to just very crudely, we're going to retouch everything from about that distance in the far distance up there with that last frame. And by doing that, we'll get an absolutely perfect result, and there's no ambiguity about which frame is best. So that's super easy and quite rewarding, a lot of bang for your buck. And after that, it's going to come down to going after bands, like these two guides I made here. You're going to determine kind of about where, say, the second to last frame is optimal, and you're going to go left to right. Now, and beware of distance changes like here. Obviously, a much closer frame is going to be better on that in certain sections of that rock wall. Oops, maybe a fourth or fifth frame, I think we decided. At any rate, I'll turn that off. Yeah, so somewhere, these are going to be much harder areas. Hopefully the stacking will have done that for you. Now, so your tricky part is going to be the moving things like the water. Now here's a trick. I think I mentioned it before. These trees here, 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 and I guess here, if those fall within that far distance frame, you can just paint over those, and even if they're waving in a hurricane, they'll be part of the distance focus and still be as sharp as they're going to be. Things like grasses down here are much more problematic, because this grass, it's quite sharp here, and you can see it's fading off here. So you're back to the focus distance band, so to speak. All right, so you're going to make a pass over in Design Stacker of doing all this and doing that retouching, and then you'll commit retouching, and when you commit that retouching, it'll give you a new one. Here's a retouched 02. You're going to save that. Well, I just use Command S, and you'll save that. I'm not going to do it right now, but you'll save that, and then open that in Photoshop, put it on top of your other layers, and see how you've done. You might look for defects, and the best way to look for defects back in Photoshop, I'll look at my stacked one here, is you'll want to go to actual pixels. And what I like to do is I'll start in a top left corner. Here a lot of it's sky, so that's not too important. But what you might notice is these clouds look weird. Well, what's going on? Well, that's actually where frames overlapped for example, let's compare that focus stacked result there to the last frame. You can see there's a lot of artifacting going on there, and that's why you want to paint over that sky area and the distance areas with that last frame. This is the last frame we're showing here, no artifacting, and that's the stack. You can see all these odd all kinds of crud and edge and artifacting and halos. So in the stack, and then in the last frame, none of that's there. So you want to get rid of that stuff. Otherwise, the work's going to look amateurish. That in a lot of landscape photos, at least a third of your scene will typically have this type of thing. So it's super easy. You just make sure you get a sharp infinity focus frame, which Fujifilm will not guarantee you, by the way, or Sony. Make sure you do it yourself after it automates it, and then you're going to use that frame. It's an absolutely critical frame. Remember, this one we're looking at doesn't look maybe quite as sharp as we expect because it's been resized to 200 megapixels from 100. All right, so you're gonna do all this, and then when you layer up that retouched frame, you're gonna layer it on top here, and then scan left to right, looking for problems. Do I see any goofy stuff? Like I can see here, there's this. I'll zoom in a little bit. There's all these weird halo artifact type things around here. That's what your retouching is going to get rid of for you. So you'll go back to Zarine Stacker, and just to show that, I'm going to say start retouching. I would have done this as the with that distance frame, but I didn't take the time before, so I'm just going to show one example of this, and I'm going to go to 100%, which on a Retina display isn't really good enough. So I'm going to go to 200%, which is really 100% on a Retina display because it's mapping 2 pixels to 1 for the. So when I go up here, I'm dragging and scrolling. You can see it's not the quickest thing in the world, and even at 200% here, it's not exactly obvious, which is why I do not recommend Retina displays for this type of work. Get something with 110 pixels per inch or something in that range. Anyway, as I start to paint this over, it will clean up all of that stuff we saw in Photoshop there. I think I might have hit this before. I can go over this tree. If there's any motion in here by using that infinity frame, you can see it's getting a little sharper just by doing that. So you do this in passes, and you can get a greatly improved result for your distance work. And then, depending on how picky you want to be, your closer range work, you can get, more and more localized. Like this little area of rock here. There's going to be a frame that's sharpest that you can paint in. Notice all the artifacting to the left of it. This weird look to it. So let's paint into that. See it disappear as I paint over it. So those are artifacts, and you definitely don't want those. And that's why you're going to make that far distance frame pass, just to cover all that stuff. And notice if I go over this rock, I've just painted in the wrong thing and blurred it badly. So you've got to be careful there. All right. So to summarize, you're gonna keep doing this until you get a result which is satisfactory in terms of artifacts and sharpness, and you're going to do that by saving and then opening in Photoshop and scanning for ugly crud like the weird looking stuff in here. You're going to look for motion artifacts, not just in water, but look for bushes. Are these bushes waving in the wind? I got lucky; they didn't wave much, and so I don't see any double images or problems there. So you might still want to retouch them just because there's probably a little bit, but so that's kind of how I go about it, and that's your overall process. I didn't go into exactly all the little tips and tricks, but that's your general approach, and it will serve you well with focus stacking. With this particular image, probably to really get like what I would call a pro grade result, because we have this very strong near to far from 5 feet away from the camera here to whatever it is to essentially infinity focus in this slant. I'm not going to worry about this area too much, but I am going to spend some time on these grasses, these bushes, anything with water in it, like down here. That's probably going to take me somewhere on the order of 15 to 20 minutes. That's what you're looking at if you want to focus stack to very high quality on an outdoor scene like this. And probably won't take more than that. Water is pretty forgiving. What you should worry about most is things like branches, double images, halo effects, and so on. All right, I hope that helps. That's my process in general. And as a final reminder, I don't think this is well done on a Retina display like a iMac 5K or a lot of the newer screens, because there's 220 dots per inch, and that just makes your life a lot harder. Pick up even a cheap 110 pixel per inch display to make your retouch